how crucial do you find sound in terms of what you're writing, and do you find that that often leads you or dictates the way you're writing when you hear something?
Very good question. Can you hear me? Great. I love sound in terms of the musicality of language. And so for me as a writer, a large part of what I do is create images and tone through words. So like, for example, in that it's about music, but a lot of it is about, I spent a long time working to try and get the tone right, not only the tone of what I was trying to say, but the tone of the writing itself. But also I really enjoy writing about music. We were talking earlier on, I'm currently writing a film, nothing like the tone of any of those things, which is set at Abbey Road in the 60s and is about the Beatles. It's actually about a young girl who wants to be a sound engineer. But ostensibly it's about the Beatles. And the tone of that, therefore, is hugely influenced by their music and the fun of that and the invention of the time.
The other question that came up whilst I was looking at the slides was seeing the globe. I know Katherine has written a lot of prose, but is also now writing drama and has had her own novels adapted for prose, for theatre, but is also something of a Shakespeare expert. And I was wondering the interrelation of the space in which you're playing, or the space in which you're writing for people to play, and the writing itself seems crucial and quite, it flows both ways, it seems, and that's been the case forever. Is that right?
Absolutely. So there are a lot of things that if you read a Shakespeare play, you perhaps wouldn't get. And maybe even they've become so ephemeral that we've lost them unless you happen to be a historian of this particular bit of Shakespeare. So there are in-jokes in Shakespeare that you wouldn't get unless you knew that, for instance, there's a scene in Cymbeline where a girl, Cymbeline, finds the beheaded body of a man she believes to be her lover. And she's devastated, and she talks about him being on a mountainside, dwarfed by the landscape. And it's a joke, because the character was played by a famous comedian called Armin, who was a hunchback dwarf. And the man who was playing the hero, who she's supposed to be mistaking him, was being played by one of three possible men, all of whom would have been famous, strapping romantic heroes. And the bit of the stage on which he would have been discovered would have been the recess at the back of the stage, which is a tiny little bit of space about the length of this table. So there are these in-jokes that you won't get. I'm not sure that that's necessarily a bad thing. I think people would have had this moment of sort of laughter that would have drawn you out of the action, so maybe we lose and we gain. And then I guess the other thing was that a lot of Shakespearean actors, as you all know, boys played all the female parts. Some of those boys were kidnapped from the streets. It was legal to kidnap boy players and indenture them into being actors. And again, I know, it's one of those things that is very little advertised, and we didn't really know this until about 30 years ago. And there are jokes within the plays that gesture towards that fact, that the sort of cultural and social landscape that you're watching, the idea of jokes being played out about social injustice, are being spoken by boys who were there against their will. When Cleopatra says, "And I will see some squeaking Cleopatra boy my greatness in the posture of a whore," she's referring to the fact that boys were sometimes used not as prostitutes, but as boys who were taken to parties and taken as a kind of sort of a figure to be looked at. They became objects, sexualized objects outside the stage. And so I guess there's the historical landscape that informs the plays as we read them now.
It's amazing. One of the other questions I had was to do with Lear, actually. I was just thinking with reference to Theatre for One, that the way you talk about the audience and the audience member and the actors co-creating the landscape between them. And then I was thinking about that moment in Lear when Lear is or believes himself to be on a cliff edge, and the fool arrives, and the audience can only go, especially in the Globe, on what we're told. And initially we believe, at the time you believe possibly Lear is on a cliff edge, because that is what he's describing, and the presence of the fool contextualizes that and gives us an awareness that Lear himself doesn't have. But the landscape itself is the very simple boards of the stage. So the contract there between the author and the actor and the mass audience, even on as broad a playing space as the Globe, is also, it's the same contract as when it's boiled down in Theatre for One. I find that kind of beautiful, I think.
It's really beautiful, except if your job is being, It's really beautiful, except if your job is being a stage designer. You often just feel like, oh God, I'm just gonna get in the way. Because you go to a first rehearsal and there's actors sitting around a table, and sometimes that read-through in the room where you're as close as we are, or even closer, is the most electric, raw version of the play you ever see. So it's very difficult to not get in the way of that beautiful contract.
The last question I had before throwing it open to you guys was sound. Obviously, we've already spoken about a bit, but one of the phrases that really struck me from your American Idiot distillation was "we must express silence." And I know you work in musicals quite a lot. Do you find that the music can sometimes preempt your reading of the text or your distillation of the text, and that the music forms that spine line that you've created there?
Yeah, definitely. It's sorry, I'm just moving my chair, but it's a combination of both the words and the music, and depending on the piece. Sometimes I will listen to the music of the production, but sometimes, like with Spring Awakening, I listen to that music, but then other music that was similar. So absolutely, yeah.
Do we have any questions from the crowd?
Can I add a little thing to that?
Yeah, go.
Just about landscape and character and music. It's quite interesting. I find it fascinating to find out where ideas came from originally, when you feel like you own a piece that you've seen because you know it very well, and then you find out that actually the writer, the idea came from something that you've had no contact with at all, that the sort of backstory to where an idea came from is something that when you get to see someone's working process can be really illuminating, like looking at your descriptions and seeing your process. In the Abbey Road film, several of the characters are directly separately inspired by characters on one of the Beatles albums. For example, The Fool on the Hill gave me a scene in the film which no one will ever know when they watch it, other than you folks if you happen to go and see it in the cinema. But quite often we use landscape as a way to get somewhere, whether it's a sound landscape or a visual landscape, even if it doesn't end up in the final product. It's a huge part of what inspires and influences us as artists.
Well said.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Do we have a microphone, or are you guys?
No, not really. We can hear you.
Without.
Yeah. Okay. So, Christine, it sounds like you are totally in charge of the scenery. Are you really? I mean, do the composer? I hope you are, but does the composer,
I
the director?
I present all of these ideas to the director, and they have to accept them and agree with them, and sometimes they won't, and we'll make revisions together. But it's something that we create together. But I do a lot of that work before I have a first meeting with the director, so that I come to the table. Sometimes I say it's like going, like traveling. Like the play is a new city that you've never been to, and I go to that city and I gather as much information as I can, and the director goes to that city and gathers their information, and then we get together and we compare notes about what we've seen. So the more thoroughly I've investigated that city before I meet with them, then I just come to the table with more.
So, did you go to Las Vegas before you did Rigoletto?
I wish. I don't always have the opportunity to do that, but if I can, then I will go to locations and take advantage of that. Yeah.
And that relationship between a director and a designer is so important. And quite often, as a director speaking with the director's hat on, you meet quite a few designers, but always in film, but often at the beginning of a theatrical process. It's why people return to the same person and work again and again, because the more you work with someone, the more easy it is to understand a process and to enjoy that. But for example, with the next film I'm directing, we've just been meeting various designers, each of whom come in with their interpretation of the script and their world, and then I will decide whose I think matches up with mine, and then when you're working with that person, it's mostly handed over to them. So it's quite important to get that relationship right in the first place. But it is one of the most exciting elements of creating a piece of theatre, and it really truly makes you appreciate other people's skill as well. Because I remember when I was directing plays at school, I used to design them myself because I just thought it's my idea, and then you start working with professional designers and think, oh, these people are so inspired. This is something that we should never judge that we can do ourselves, because the more actually the collaboration between different people working together, it's so much more than the sum of its parts.
Jess, if I can just quickly, with your director's hat on, when you've been on location or filming, or how have you found that the real landscape influences your work as director compared to how you see it and use it when you're working as a writer? Because surely there's something where it's uncontrollable versus the controllable.
Ooh, good question. Well, the film that we're shooting next year is called Summerland, and it's about a folklore fictional landscape and about a real landscape. And we're shooting in Kent. And in order to write it, in order to get the tone of it right, I went to write in Kent. And so I feel like the writing has been hugely influenced by that landscape. But when we go to shoot it, it'll be a lot to do with the way the cinematographer sees it too, in order to come up with a version of it which is what I thought, plus what they thought, plus what the designer thinks, and to find the most magical version of that.
And Julian, I thought you had a question?
Christine, I was amazed by your presentation. Well, I wasn't amazed. I was delighted by your presentation, and I feel as though I've not seen anything you've done, or what you've done at all. And I feel as though I haven't been living these last few years, which is probably true. But I want to ask you about there's something what you do all the time. As far as I can tell from what your images on the screen, is that you litter the screen. You litter the whole stage. You cover everything, everywhere, with light and with things and with collages. And is litter conscious?
Well, sometimes, first of all, I probably, now that you say that, I probably could have shown you more work that doesn't only have that. I don't think that's something that I always do. I think that the examples there are definitely in that realm. And sometimes we call it maximalism, as opposed to minimalism, maximalism. And I think these pieces in particular just felt extremely dense in terms of their locations and their energy. Spring Awakening is a play that's spoken and sung, so you have a lot of different vocabularies happening and danced. American Idiot, also a punk rock opera, essentially, which was mostly, there was very, very little dialogue, and it was mostly danced. So I think those pieces in particular are maximalist. And I suppose it is, on some level, sometimes we talk with students and say, don't worry about creating a style, you have your own style. And I suppose on some level that is my style, or my language, which is dense and rich, and I probably went to a flea market one too many times.
But is this something to do with today?
With today?
Yeah. With your experience of life today?
With my experience of life today. You don't have to answer. You can ask me anything, I'll always answer that. I suppose, you can tell by my necklaces. I probably am somebody that attaches to objects emotionally. And so I suppose in some ways there's an accumulation of every experience that I've had. In fact, I do think about the set, and as much as I talked about light making it come true, I also think there's a process by which you do need to personally invest in the space. So I will often bring photos of my kids, or I'll ask the actors to bring family photos, or to write on the set. For Harry Potter, we had all these school desks, and I asked the actors to engrave their initials in the desks to really mark the space with their humanity, to make it come alive, because it is wood and paint and paper, and we have to bring it to life. So I hope that answers your question.
I was just going to add to that. Let the right one in. What was amazing was your maximalism went absolutely to minimalism. And what was incredible was the silver birch trees and the snow and the blue light and that silence, that incredible silence. And it was just everything stripped away. And then the maximalism was brought in. And that was, I mean, it was operatic, you know, and musical in the way that it flowed from maximalism to minimalism. That was for you, Julian. Seeing as you've not been watching any contemporary theatre for a long time, but we'll put you right.
We're going to put you in it. We're going to give you a role.
Okay, I hope I'm allowed 2 questions, one of which we saw your beautiful scenic design, but we know that in theater you want a cohesive overall aesthetic. At what point do you sit down with the costume department, the wig department, the lighting designer, and make sure that your color palettes, your sensibilities, and all that are in harmony?
Well, as Julia pointed out, I'm in charge of everything, so I'm just kidding. It depends on the project. Sometimes from the very beginning, the director and the designers have all of our meetings together and we co-create simultaneously. And other times, just because of how life is, I will have the first meetings with the directors, and then as soon as we can, we fold in the other designers. For Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, it was a unique experience in that we literally spent every single rehearsal together in the room. We did 3 workshops leading up to the production, and all the designers were there for every rehearsal, for every workshop, and I think you can tell when you see the show. Yeah.
And one other question before I give up this mic. Those sets are intellectual property. When you're hired to design them, who owns the rights to your designs?
Essentially, I do, unless I think maybe with Harry Potter they might own it. They might own everything. And I know when you work for Disney, which I haven't done, they own everything. Yeah. But you know, there's a wonderful essay. I don't know if any of you know it, called "The Ecstasy of Influence" by Jonathan Lemme, and it's just sort of gorgeous in terms of its way of talking about copyright, and there's no such thing. I mean, it's a cliche to say there's no such thing as an original idea, but the way he outlines it in the essay is so generous and just talks about the influence that we have on each other both. And I think this symposium speaks to that, that whether you're a poet or a musician or a writer or a filmmaker or an environmentalist, on some level we are all connected and influencing each other. So I believe in the free flow of work, and I don't try to hold on to it too tightly.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for these wonderful insights into the work you do. I was wondering, in these landscapes you depict, say from writing the play or doing the set design or working on the play, I wonder where in this landscaping does the actor come in, and which influence does, once the actors are on stage or in the play, embody your characters, what happens for you that have been there before?
I'll start just to say that there are times where, you know, one of the things I tell my students too is the very first thing you should do when you make a model is you should make all the figures. So we make figures for scale that you put in the model, and it's the first thing you should do, because I do believe that on some kind of voodoo karma level, those figures invite your set into this empty black box. So it's very important to start with them. It's very important to always look at the model with the figure in it. Actually, Mike was saying earlier, I cut a line out of what I was saying that basically says that landscape exists despite humans, but a theater landscape really exists in deference to and is kind of inseparable from. So it's very important to keep the figure in mind. And then, you know, those are just little cardboard figures, and sometimes when you do get on stage, there are moments where I find that there's a whole piece of scenery that I designed to fly in that is completely unnecessary, because when the actor is on stage or the singer is on stage singing that aria, we really don't need to see a piece of scenery fly in. So, so more often than not, design can get in the way.
Do we have any other questions? in that, oh, one more last question.
It's probably a question for you, Mike. I was just wondering, thinking back to the play we saw on the first night, what the reaction of directors would be to a landscape like that behind your dramatic work.
Terror.
And maybe
terror and depression, by and large. I think there was, with that landscape, we were actually blessed that we started off quite late, because we've been rehearsing throughout the day, and we did a dress rehearsal the night before where we started off at 7 o'clock and you couldn't see any detail on the actors' faces. So in response, during the day of the performance, when we were rehearsing, we had the actors kind of dial it up by a factor of 10 to get it across. And then, I don't know about you, but I found over the course of the performance, there was something, especially if those of you who saw it will, I'm sure, remember the endless step-by-step moment that Katherine did. I found after that moment was when it was really getting dark outside, and a new intimacy came about the piece as the actors brought it back down to the level we'd almost originally been rehearsing at. So the landscape in that case, I mean, in that case it was really the lighting drastically informed what we were doing in terms of the playing itself. But then also I sat down with Phil, who wrote the piece, about 5-6 weeks before before yesterday, the day before yesterday, and I told him what this was, and because we did a play last year, I told him how distracting it was going to be beforehand, and so he really worked that into the piece itself. And the concept of this body of water and the ships going past beneath, I think in the kind of post-apocalyptic world he painted was characterized by the text. So, I mean, it influenced us heavily, both in ways we could prepare for and in ways which we sort of last minute scrambled to accommodate.
There's also something very specific and I think unique to theatre, which is why, as much as it's attractive in some ways to spend time making films instead of plays, why I'll never leave the theatre, and that's the liveness of the experience, and it's something that you just cannot get or recreate, because a play will only exist in that moment with the people in that space, which is why it's so exciting playing in a space where you can see the audience, because you're very aware of the fact that it's a single moment where there's a unique relationship between you and the people who are watching, and it feels in a way like anything could happen outside the building, but for that moment you're all there together and it's very special. And what I really enjoy about that is the risk of anything happening and the fact that something can go wrong or something strange can happen, and because it only happens in that moment, it's magical. And I will never forget, I was directing Nell's play Bedlam at the Globe outside, which was about the Bethlehem Hospital, which was the madhouse in the 1700s, and there's a character in it who imagined she could hear the birds singing and see the birds, and she couldn't. She was crazy. And in the final scene, there's a scene where she sort of meets, she's talking to her lover, and she's talking about the birds, and there's a moment where you know that she is just in that world and she's just seeing these birds in her head, and at that moment a bird came and landed on the stage in one particular performance, and it was as if the world had just turned, and it was a pigeon. So we hadn't made it happen. It was obvious that it was something so random, but she then responded to that by being able to see it. And you thought, well, he can see it too. So is this because he's tuned into her madness, or what's going on there? And you don't get that anywhere else. So sometimes the landscape can inform you in ways that you never expect. And that's one of the joys of a live piece of performance, I think.
One thing I'd add to that, actually, in sort of defense of film as well, is that you can have moments. I definitely agree. The work I've done for the theatre there's a spontaneity to it that is unique, without doubt. But with film as well, there are moments where landscape, the uncontrollable, can intrude upon what you're shooting and surprise the actor and surprise what you're doing, and that spontaneity is captured on film. The audience don't know it in the same way that they can see something unpredictable happening and they can see the actor adjust on stage, but it does really affect performance. There was a moment when we were shooting a version we did recently of Macbeth where the actor had been, the entire stage set had been blown away up on the island of Skye, and the producers were all sort of abandoning ship to go and make insurance claims. And the actor, Michael Fassbender, had sort of ridden up this mountain on a horse, and the temperature was about 4 degrees, which was, it was illegal to have him out in that temperature in just this sheet and nothing else. And he rode back down, and he'd been playing it on every other take where it, you know, the landscape was obeying what I'd written, and being quite kind of stormy, but not too bad. And he'd been playing it in a kind of broody way when he rode the horse back down. And then this time he just rode back down like howling with laughter. And we captured it on film, and it just fits the moment so perfectly. And in the film, when you're watching the film, it just looks like that's how he was directed, but he was directed by the landscape in a very spontaneous way, which I found really interesting. But anyway, on that note, I would just like to say a huge thank you to these three and to all of you. And yeah, a round of applause.